Welcome to the reality show. Today it's me, Mark, and Richard. How's it going, guys?
Well, thank you.
Very good, thanks. And how are you, Morgan? I feel like we never asked.
I'm okay. I'm getting over my cold, or I'm pretty much over it. So I'm actually finally no longer just sort of lethargic and weepy.
Yeah, of
So
course, we lost the insulation at the top now as well.
yeah, that was the funny side effect of my cold. All my hair fell out, it seems. But there we go.
Very nasty.
Um, so the topic we're going to be talking about today, guys, is of the Muslim vote. So of Muslim as a voting democratic wasn't demography wasn't what the word, not a democratic, a demographic. There we go, in our society, and how we should think about that. It's a very controversial issue. Lots of people on the right very, very concerned and worked up about it. Lots of people on the left I think it would be fair to say, I generally want to poo-poo that kind of concern. And we, as always, are going to try and walk a rational line on these kind of issues and think about how we should think about it and so on and so forth. So Mark and Richard, obviously, some of the context, we're not going to talk too much about it, is the Rochdale by-election, which is going on just right now. Rochdale is a very heavily Muslim area, and people think that's probably going to affect the outcome of the election. So when it comes to thinking about the increasing role that Islam's playing in our democracy, how do you guys think about it? Are you concerned, as some people are?
I think one of the first things I think is probably worth doing just before we get into that in any details, just to make a couple of just broad comparisons or contrasts rather between the UK and the US, because there are some huge differences. I mean, that if you're asking that question here, as opposed to in the US, even in somewhere like Dearborn or Hamtramck, as we sometimes mention, you're going to get a different result. You're going to get a different emphasis. And at the broadest level, it's worth stressing that even the two main parties in the UK, the Conservatives and Labour, do not equate to Democrats and Republicans in the US. They're probably both versions of the Democrats in some sense, neither being versions of the Republicans. And of course, religion generally as a subject within for any election is as good as non-existent in the UK. Nobody talks about religion normally. Now, we're going to get into the Muslim bit in a minute, but religion generally, Christianity, whatever, through the decades that I've seen elections, it's never featured as a subject. It's not they're not tied to one particular party or another. And that relates partly to the fact that there's a very small number of people who claim to be Christian, say, for example. And even if they're Christian, although they might be stress tradition over their Christianity, and that might lead them to vote for the Conservatives over Labour. But they also, they're all altruists, essentially. And altruism is what drives them most of all. And it's the left that stresses the altruism even more than the Conservatives, even though they stress it substantially in most of their policies. So that is what tends to drive people who are partly Christian, but mostly altruist. And all of it leads towards more statism. So I think as a broad picture, it's worth stating that, because when we're talking about this Muslim vote, it's a new concept, really, in recent times, to have a religious opinion affecting how people vote politically at all. And I know that's not the same in certain southern US states with evangelical groups and leanings towards republicanism and stuff. So just as a background.
And we should remember that when we say Muslim vote, we're talking about lots of individuals, our neighbors, our friends, people we know and work with, we live with. And it's important to remember that the issue here is not that Muslims shouldn't be allowed to vote. They are individuals who contribute to society and deserve to have the right to vote like everybody else. I mean, that would be absurd to argue the opposite. Here, the issue here is that we got an Islamic agenda which overlays some religious-based tribalism, and that's the upsetting thing, that we're in 2024 talking about religious-based tribalism, and that's the thing that really get on my nerves. Of course, there are Christian parties throughout Europe. Here in Britain, it doesn't really matter as much, as Richard said. But there are religious groups who tend to push through a certain agenda. Now, the issue here that the not only the Muslim Islamic vote is new, but the demands that Islam imposes on its electoral base are very much not in line with our values. And that's where the conflict arises. Islam, whether you're a woke person or not, Islam is not a religion of peace, and Islam is not trying to make the world a better place in the sense that it wants to expand knowledge and freedom and equality. The opposite, exactly the opposite. They want to impose a religious-based authoritarian view of the world. And effectively, if you are a liberal, if you are a certain kind of person, they want you dead, or they want you significantly put in your box so you don't disrupt the religious proceedings.
And I think just to add, one of the reasons we're talking about this right now, sorry, Morgan, is just to say a new organization has been set up called the Muslim Vote, with its own website, etc., which is trying to galvanize one direction in each constituency for Muslims to know how to vote, to essentially be told how to vote. And they've already listed 90 constituencies in England where there's at least 10% of the electorate is Muslim. Some of that rises to 40% Muslim in some of those constituencies. Most are typically around 15% in this list of 90. They're yet to do the same for Scotland, where they're contrasting what the majority was at the last election, what the percentage of Muslims in that constituency is, and how that MP voted when it comes to Gaza and ceasefires in recent parliamentary elections. And therefore, they're coming up with a recommended candidate, what they call a community-endorsed candidate. So it's a grassroots advice from each constituency, all the Muslim groups within that constituency, essentially being brought together to recommend a candidate that everybody who's Muslim in that area is being told they should vote for.
Yes. I also want to just join in your kind of disclaimers that you put up, that sometimes when people are talking about the role of Muslims in British society, there's a very unsavory tone that gets taken. And I think, although there are people who are overly afraid of talking about it, that certainly there are people who understandably want to avoid the kind of conversation that might come out of groups like the English Defence League and all that kind of unsavory, ugly stuff. And I just want to say, I don't want anything to do with that. I don't think anything we say could reasonably be understood that way. But if anyone's just concerned, I don't think we have anything to do with anything like any of that. Even with my current hairstyle, which is not for that reason. So, yes, I think, and a further distinction with the US, I think you're right, Richard, in pointing out the irreligiosity generally of British politics. We have a lot of socialism involved, which might be a kind of secular religion, like the NHS, but a lot of the old-fashioned mystical religion we don't have and haven't had for a very long time. There's a lot of that if you really go back in British history, but from the 20th century onwards, not at all, really. And the growth of Muslims into religion in the late 20th century is, in a sense, the re-injection of a large politically motivated or politically active religious groups. It's right to say that a lot of Muslims don't vote to some extent, but also if they do vote, they're going to be voting with their religion in mind. A lot of British Protestants, who I tend to refer to as milky tea Protestants, because they're sort of utterly charming and nice and not very offensive in their political views. They all just want to sort of muddle through. That's reflected in the Church of England and its very sort of liberal, sort of defanged, I think, stances on things. They don't represent a big. Daniel's asking who puts milk in tea. These people do, and they put too much, and they just want to potter around on the weekends at church halls and drink tea and talk and eat biscuits. And so politically, they aren't a significant or notable force at all. Whereas in a sense, the concern here is the growth of a group that is going to be voting with its religion in mind, which for anyone who holds secular liberal values should be concerning no matter which group it is, whether they're Muslim or not. And in this case, it just happens to be this group. And then a distinction with the US as well being that, interestingly, the data suggests that Muslims in the US are actually increasingly liberal, to the point where, by some polling, over 50% of US Muslims support the legalization of gay marriage, whereas in the UK, that's not the case at all. in one Gallup poll that was taken in 2009, 100% of British Muslims who were polled said that they thought homosexuality was immoral, and 18% said that it should be legal. So that's a huge disparity and represents a very troubling worldview, I think, if that's going to be involved in their voting behavior, and very much represents a departure from the basis of Western liberal values, which basically informs British society. Mark and Richard, any other thoughts on this generally?
I just wanted to mention as an aside that it's worth mentioning Northern Ireland as being the exception to what we've been talking about in terms of sectarian religious voting tendencies. Obviously, Protestant and Catholic we're talking about there, but that's really its own isolated case. It doesn't affect the rest of the United Kingdom, and it's its own history. And really, if you want to get into that, it deserves its own episode and some more, bigger experts than I. But anyway. Yeah, so I just wanted to make that point. Okay. Did you want to say something?
Well, yes, and Northern Ireland is its own fraught history, which might be even more controversial than this, actually. And in a sense, I guess, I think one of the things that has allowed the growth of this kind of this political religious kind of voting base, which I think politicians are increasingly taking note of, I think probably is multiculturalism. And I'm hailing back there to our conversation about it the other day, I think on the show on Tuesday. Because if you watch any of the documentaries or just interviews with lots of the very politically motivated, often Islamic young men, but women as well, they're quite contemptuous of what you might refer to as the kind of status quo British society and British values. They certainly view it as something that's quite weak, and without foundation, I think, is ultimately how they view it. And I think that is the result of multiculturalism. Now, there's a question about what exactly are British values, and lots of people, I think, actually aren't very certain about that. It's not quite like the US, where I could print out for you on 20 sides the US Constitution and then give you the Declaration of Independence, say, here you go, here's a very short read where you get American values. In Britain, it's more ephemeral, it's not very clear. People end up talking about tea and politeness and queuing, which can't be the basis of a society, maybe of a village, but not of a country.
Sorry, Morgan, we're not the United States, but here there's always a feeling of individual rights and freedom. So that's as close as you get to. Freedom of the press, and that's why the United States were founded, and they came effectively. They were colonies of the United of Britain, because that was the kind of culture that was implanted in the colonies. So.
And of course, none of us are happy to the extent to which that's being eroded over time and lessened by regulation and the imposition and the expansion of the statist government. But nevertheless, it still underlies an awful lot of what represents British values, I think.
So I was say that's all true. But in a sense, maybe the difference between America and Britain is that in Britain it was implicit often. There was some articulation of it, but whereas in America they sort of proudly said it with their full chest. In Britain it was often much more implicit, and I think that's why people end up circling around and trying to put their finger on it. And they will say things like freedom of the press, and that's fair enough. That's certainly true. But in the way that Americans can sort of really put their finger on it, I think British people have a bit more of a tough time. But sorry, go on, Richard.
And of course, some of that's a legacy of the Second World War and defining what nationalism and patriotism and fears that it's nationalism that led to the Second World War, and therefore anything that looks remotely like it, including waving your own flag in any capacity, is left to one night at the last night of the proms at the Albert Hall and little more, and the odd royal wedding, and that's about it. There's that history there.
And although, as you said, the British values are not formalized like the United States, there is still a kind of sense of life which is typically British, which is, it's giving you the kind of implicit freedom, as you said. And coming from abroad, I grew up in Europe, and lots of European people come to Britain because of the tangible sense of freedom that is here compared to the continental Europe. Continental Europe don't understand freedom as such. They are based, even the legal system is a permission to live rather than you can do what you want unless it's illegal. That's what happens in Britain, and that what undermines still a sense of life. It's waning, but it's still there.
Yes, for sure. And I agree with everything you just said. I'll say as well, one of the most cringeworthy events in my teenage years was when I was studying religious studies at school. The British government passed laws about having to teach British values in any religious studies class. And actually, if you read the documents where they tried to articulate what British values were, it was really bad. And that doesn't mean that British values don't exist, but just even they, the people who should really know, because it should be informing how they think about legislation, really had a very poor understanding. At best, they'll say things like the British sense of fair play and things, and it's very muddled. But go on, Richard. You were going to say something.
But that's British values as defined by a civil servants committee and several focus groups. And have we covered everybody under the sun? And have we offended nobody? And is it weak enough to not to scare the horses? And therefore, let's go with that. I think this is part of the thing that makes Britain what it is. Has always been it is ephemeral. It is sort of understood, not written down. It's almost the fact we don't have a written constitution. All of that is sort of understood through tradition, through habit, through. But of course, that does change over time. It does become less obvious. I think what you were talking about in some of your opening remarks concerning the Muslim vote and the two sides of the electoral spectrum and their response to it, and whether the left poo-poo this as a worry, I think that is beginning to change in the sense that it's the left that are most likely to be affected by a bulk decision by this sector of the electorate to shift their vote elsewhere. Or to whereas they've always been taken for granted by predominantly Labour but left-wing parties. I think 80% of Labour has 80% of the Muslim vote in the past, and recent polls have suggested that that's dropped by 26% and is down in the 60s now or below. I think and this is related to Gaza. And what's happened since October 7th and the response to the Labour Party and the fact that it hasn't, according to the Muslim vote, been firm enough calling for a ceasefire from day one and has not taken. And that's what all of this is about, really, at the moment. But it's been coming to a head for some time, I think, because of that expectation that Labour would always get the Muslim vote and therefore could have been considered perhaps to have taken it for granted in the past. But my overall opinion is that this feels like a regression in the sense that religion is coming back into play. And also that when we talk about small groups, and we're often talking about objectivists and how few people it takes to change a culture or whatever, but obviously that works in all sorts of different ways for all sorts of different groups. And of course, here, what ends up being the case is that each constituency, and Rochdale will be a classic example of that, but each constituency is suddenly voting on Muslim issues, whether they're for Muslim issues or completely disinterested in Muslim issues, but are compelled to vote and express the opinion that they're against those Muslim issues even being an issue. Suddenly that becomes top of the agenda, and not like the cost of living or the economy or the amount of taxation and regulation or the authoritarian versus state argument.
And the problem is also that our politicians have been covering their eyes and ears for way too long, and the Islamic presence is mainly an issue of immigration. It's not an homegrown thing. Largely, it's immigration driven, and that's why it's so sudden. And that's why when it comes up, politicians tend to pretend it's not there because it's too hard to tackle without being accused of being racist or whatever. And the issue with Islam is that it's a very consistent in its belief, and people who believe in Islam tend to go with the flow, tend to listen to the line that's been imposed to them, and some of the stuff that you see from this Vote Muslim website is actually quite frightening. If you look at the website itself, it's got a series of demands, effectively, what they call their demands, and they seem fairly civilized. They're crazy. Most of them are incredibly racist and crazy, but they could fit some sort of political line. But if you then look at their Twitter account, the kind of stuff that they say is actually quite frightening. They go as far as sounding even threatening. There's a particularly hilarious one which says something like Islamist, the politically correct term to use when saying Islamophobic things. I mean, what the heck?
They say, we see through it and we will vote. Now, if you're conflating Islamism and Islamophobia together, then my goodness, that's some package deal you've got going on there.
There is another one from February 25th. Assume this year. It says something like, contrary to popular discourse, most Muslims see Britain as our home, and we want to make Britain great again. It's like, really? We care about this country just as much as any other Britisher. We help disproportionately power the NHS. What the heck? We don't want Sharia law for all, but we do want justice. So the implication in this tweet is quite telling, to be honest.
And as is, of course, that call to the NHS as being, as you said, as you referred earlier, Morgan, the religion of the country, and we disproportionately, serve the NHS. It speaks volumes, really, to that call for kudos. Yes,
absolutely. I don't know if I agree that it's primarily an issue of immigration, Marco, just in the sense that obviously Islam, if you go back a few decades in British history, wouldn't have been a notable demographic at all, and has grown and initially will have grown through immigration. But when I think about, for example, the terror attacks that happened in the mid part of the last decade, at least as I remember, they were mostly a second generation issue, as I remember. So even though I don't think those first generation who came in integrated very well into society, and we got that kind of ghettoization where there's communities who are isolated and don't really speak to each other, and I think grow contemptuous of the idea of even God, I just used the word, I forgot it, of fitting in. I think what we've seen is largely an issue of the second generation who are then contemptuous of fitting in and become radicalized by the prospects of the religion from where their parents came from. And I think that, in a sense, is the problem of multiculturalism that we're seeing. You're nodding. Do you agree with that? Or
yeah, well, you're right. I mean, there's always been a big contingent of Muslim population in Britain, but the fact that between the census 2011 and 2021 there was an increase of 1.2 million Muslims here in Britain, so over a decade. That in partly the increased number in the latest decades is due to immigration. Of course, yeah, we always had a proportion, but it's now an issue because the organic growth of the population, if you like, is being compounded by immigration as well. It's not just an immigration issue, of course. Yeah.
And there is, of course, birthing rates as well within that, and larger families within Muslim groups. And there's a definite link, I've got to say this out loud, there's a definite link between welfare and Muslim groups as well. And that in itself can have an effect on numbers of children within families. And also the ways in which multiple generations often live together within Muslim families. So that continuity of religion is maintained and kept as strong as the first immigration group through living together and through the imposition of stricter rules than perhaps might be the case where people disseminate more and more integrate more among other groups. So, and also if you've got to look at the education levels as well, the numbers are far less going to university and that kind of thing. So that there's a lot less experience of the world, experience of Britain even. It can be very, very ghettoized pocket living, and that can exaggerate some of the difficulties.
Certainly. And so how do you guys think about this then? So, I sent you guys a couple of links to GB News, and if anyone's ever, watched GB News, they're more naturally people who will be very concerned about this and want to speak about this as a threat to fundamental British values. And they're the people in a sense who people on the left might be decrying or trying to de-emphasize in some way. And Nigel Farage is one of their pundits, who, even though nominally UKIP's message was to leave the European Union, that was a kind of an issue that he would stand up and talk about, and would want to kind of face head on. And the suggestion by people on the left, I think, is basically that it's not as bad an issue as these people are making out. They're probably motivated by prejudices of other kinds, and that's what's informing their resistance here. So how do you guys think about it? Are you concerned by this? Do you think it will have bad effects for the country? Do you see it as being successful in the long term? Or do you think that there is something kind of right, that people on the right are probably overemphasizing it a little bit?
Well, yeah, I mean, people on the right tend to be uber conservative in the wrong way, or the wrong meaning of the word. They trying to cling on to the blitz sense of community, but that's gone. That was 80 years ago. You have to accept the fact that the world is more interconnected, and as long as we are all dealing on an individual basis, it's a group of individuals choosing to deal with other individuals rather than being imposed by some sort of state or super state structure, and that's the issue here, really. The fact that multiculturalism determines some privileges for some groups, and some group are held back in order to push this idea of equality of outcome. That's what creates the friction between groups of people and between individuals. But again, if we manage to get rid of the state interfering in everybody's life, and reduce the state to its legitimate function of protecting individual rights, people will just get along with each other, because people individuals have interest in making their life better, and everybody would do that, and everybody would collaborate together. But the forced imposition of rules, it's causing lots of problems.
I think the response to some of this is equally as worrying as the potential problem itself, is that the answer to one religion is posed as another religion. And suddenly, people are claiming to be Christian, or who never claimed to be Christian in the past, simply because they want to counter this the swing towards the Muslim values, which they don't agree with. And that is likely to end up with a bunch of religious parties, not just the Muslim vote, but the Christian vote may well follow, and there may well be a form of imitation to this, maybe to lesser degrees of success in terms of moving people as solid blocks about. But nevertheless, I think that's quite a worrying concern. I mean, to take one of the examples from this website, take the constituency of Ilford North, for example, where West Streeting is the current MP. He's a Labour MP with a majority of about 5,000. I think the Muslim majority there, the Muslim vote there, is something like 25,000, if I'm remembering from memory. And that's one of the key constituencies that could easily switch hands simply by the Muslim vote shifting away from him to a new candidate that is being proposed as a pro-Palestinian activist. So suddenly, all of the people who live in Ilford North, their politics is going to be decided by a pro-Palestinian activist rather than anything to do with Ilford North, or with it becomes a one-issue thing, and then suddenly, how do you then interpret all of the results you get come election time? I think we've been through a period with things like the Brexit vote, for example, where across the political spectrum, and different candidates were for it and were against it. And obviously, in the course of those many years of discussion and several different forms of election that took place, there were many websites and lists for people as to which is the Brexit candidate, pro-Brexit, which is the anti-Brexit candidate in a given constituency, people choosing to vote at the next election on that basis. But So that maybe has set some of the thinking in mind. But of course, when you vote in any election, you're trying to weigh up lots and lots of different factors in on what decides who you vote for. And all the time, it feels that that's being shrunk down to is this person A or B? And no thinking beyond that is required. And therefore that is only going to end up leading us into probably more statism as ever, off the back of it, because after you've either kept in the candidate you want or kept out the candidate you don't want, then they're actually going to do something for 4 years, and nobody's even considered what those are. So it's this very narrow-minded, who's the good guy? Is he on my team? Is he not? And all of that troubles me for how simplistic and tribalist it's becoming.
And this so-called Muslim vote, it's actually the people supporting, pushing this agenda are actually behaving in a way which is not really tolerable. It's not really suitable to the way we run a democracy. For example, they tend to intimidate rather than make a point and fight on an intellectual basis. That's why we had the projection of From the River to the Sea on the Elizabeth Tower in Parliament. That's why the proceeding within Parliament itself have been tainted, if you like, or have been distorted by the presence of this mob, which effectively was threatening the proceeding, threatening the MPs. MPs now are seen as open targets, which is totally unacceptable. And no point in the past this has ever happened. We have a situation where even the Prime Minister talks about a mob mentality and evading what the actually origin of the mob is. This mob is clearly an Islamic motivated mob, but still they don't have the cashews to talk about what the real issue is. These are Islamic motivated mob trying to interfere with a democratic process. And of course, all this is affecting our way of life, and that's why people are not very happy about it. And another of the things that this website was pushing was sorry, I just lost it. Let's see. One of the claims was what the heck is gone?
Sorry. Do you want me to say something whilst you find it?
Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Sure. No, it's okay. I was going to say, because I generally think this is something that should be spoken about, and I don't like the people who suggest in effect that you shouldn't talk about these kind of things. But I also understand the concern about some of the people on the right, in the sense that, so I sent you guys a video the other day, I don't know if you ended up watching it, from Henry Bolton, who used to be the leader of UKIP until they had to resign because of a scandal over his girlfriend. And he put up this video in response to the Lee Anderson comments, where he was decrying kind of being called far right in that very defensive way that they end up getting. And he was saying, we're not far right or unreasonable or extremist, but what I do, I don't go into these people's communities and I don't end up judging them. We just want to be left alone. And in a sense, he actually then, towards the end of the video, started tracing some of that same rhetoric that's almost multicultural. It's just, you've got your community, you stay over there, we'll stay in ours. And it sounded very separationist. And so he ended up sounding like the thing he's trying to claim not to be. And I think basically he was too thick to realize that he was actually ended up doing that, and he posted that video anyway. And so there is a concern, in a sense, I think, about the unintellectual right, where it's very much appealing to people's emotions. Obviously, emotions get stirred up by the terrorist attacks that were the result of Islamic terror groups in the mid-2010s, or as a result of the grooming gangs in places like Rochdale. And in a sense, that aspect of the right is trying to appeal to people's resentment about that. And whilst people obviously feel concerned about that and should do, that does trouble me. But then on the flip side, as you were saying about the tribalism, Richard, I resent in effect that that we only have these two wings. We've got the people who are wanting to resist the emotionalism of the right, but then in effect suggest you can't really talk about this. And then you have the right who wants to talk about it, but then end up being very emotional. And the cure for multiculturalism, as I'm going to argue in the article I'm posting on the weekend, which hopefully I will post, is to judge and to be judgmental. The ethos of the age is don't judge me, whereas Rand very much says judge and prepare to be judged. And it's unfortunate that the right are the ones who are judgmental, but who are judgmental in the wrong way. They'll judge, but then they've got all this other stuff coming in as well, which makes them unappealing. And for a society to have a healthy sense of its own identity, which is that thing we're sort of lacking, as we were saying, we need to be more judgmental and to very confidently say, no, this doesn't represent our fundamental values, which are of freedom and tolerance in a certain sense, and leaving people to live their lives as they see fit. And to do that, you need to be judgmental. You can't say, I don't want to judge. I reserve all judgments. But anyway, go on, Marco. Did you find that?
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened with the left. They exploited the Muslim vote as a voting reservoir, and now because they are big enough to push forward demands, now the Labour Party itself is suffering from it. And to be honest, it's quite to be honest, it's justice this, because the left here in Britain is quite happy to close their eyes about animal welfare when it comes to Islam and religion generally, because suddenly the rights of animals are no longer infringed by the slaughter of halal and kosher meat for religious purposes. Suddenly the suffering of animals no longer matters because Muslim and stuff like that is involved. LGBT rights can be even pushed on a second rank of the scale of victimhood. And of course, women's rights. I mean, we've seen some of the interviews you sent. Actually, you're looking at women literally wearing the symbol of their own oppression. And it's true, some women choose to wear the garb that Muslim women are supposed to wear. But if you go to Iran, you haven't got the choice. So, the argument doesn't stand of freedom to choose.
And I think within many traditional families here, you don't have the choice because of what the elders within that family will insist upon.
Yeah, but to go back to that Muslim Vote website, one of the political demands is about Palestine, and it's the first set of demands that they set out, and it's of course a ceasefire, no explanation, ceasefire, full stop, and recognition of the state of Palestine, and denies visas to Israeli politicians and militants, and all sort of stuff. Even demands of education. They demand that schools have the right to not discuss certain issues like LGBT issues, for example, if the school is in an area where the population is mainly religion, i.e., they are trying to find a legal way to be able to ignore what we call the British values because of their religion background. That's totally unacceptable, this kind of stuff.
I think one of the things I've noticed in how the left is responding to this, and we've seen this in a number of areas, is how they seem able to compartmentalize their thinking and to not see the contradictions that exist across different elements of the thinking. For example, one of the candidates that's particularly pro-Palestine is a Green Party candidate in the constituency of Brighton, which has previously voted for the Green Party and currently has a Green Party MP. And now Brighton is if somebody was asked to name what's the the city with the most gay people in the country, they'd name Brighton straight away. So what you have here is that contradiction that exists between a city that has got a large gay population and is definitely very lefty, and is so much so that it's voted Green in the past. It's voted there, and all of the people who live there generally, the issues that they're concerned about are the fact that the bins are all over the place and the rubbish is everywhere, that pesticides were banned for 5 years, and therefore the streets suddenly spouted weeds like nobody's business, and all the roads were spouting weeds, and the thing looks a total mess, and they had to roll back on that and then reintroduce the pesticides despite being the Green Party because reality kicked back, but all of those issues about what is my town going to look like in terms of its physical infrastructure, or whether somebody collects the rubbish properly, and all those kind of things get swept away. And at the same time, you've got this pro-Palestinian candidate and a heavy gay population who are also likely to be voting for them. This is your Queers for Palestine crossover, which then doesn't seem to recognise that's a contradiction in terms, and I find it really hard to square how people can really think in that way. I think it's simply, what is the considered to be good person, or how am I supposed to vote on this subject? What's considered the good candidate? And tick, 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 and then doesn't link up the thinking at all, doesn't integrate any of it.
Yes, well, I think you're exactly right about that. And in a sense, you said, I don't know how they end up thinking like that. But as you're saying, in a sense, it's not even thought. It's just, what does the people who I should agree with think? I'm going to go with that. And do you see the political parties really being swayed by this? So there are a few years ago, when Jeremy Corbyn and Theresa May were still leader of the Labour Party, they put up videos celebrating Eid, for example, and they were very cringy. They were sort of trying to be really soft and lovely into the camera, and ended it by saying Eid Mubarak, and being really nice. But that's, in a sense, maybe more surface level, but does represent, I guess, a shift away from the history where they wouldn't do that at all. Now, I don't think politicians should release public messages celebrating any holidays, because then logically they would have to do all of them, and they should be neutral. However, that's maybe a sign that there's some influence here, that it would basically be because they're recognizing that as a significant demographic within the population. I haven't notably seen it swaying political policy, so far as I'm aware, except perhaps on the Gaza issue. But do you guys see it being a meaningful force in the decisions that our political parties are making?
Probably not yet, but as Farage pointed out, this is probably the beginning of a change in our politics, unless our politicians are able to navigate through the Swan and try and reverse the tanker here and go back to a kind of properly democratic system where everybody's voice counts the same. I'm not sure. I'm not sure we're going to see very happy elections from now on. Of course, now the issues are, as you said, mainly about Palestine. But in my experience, this kind of Islamists and the kind of appeasement that the left tend to give them and allow them, they start with something, they move on, and eventually, before you know where you are, certain bigger issues are on the table, and you have to make a decision. And I think by that time, it might be way too late. Hopefully, my favorite view would be when finally politicians and people generally realize that religion is just something so medieval, so from the past, that it doesn't make any sense. Try and apply your own values rather than something given to you by a ghost in the sky. And it would be nice to see religion take its position as something that we used to do when we're ignorant and primitive. But
I think this Rochdale election, it's got a bit of a dog's dinner of a set of candidates, and with nothing positive in it. So whether is this really the litmus test of what's to come? It's a little step on the road, possibly. I think we're due a national election, a general election here in the UK before January next year, and it's likely to be the autumn. And I think the Labour Party would much rather it was sooner rather than later, because they are struggling to hold their coalition together of people who are trying to appease both the Jewish vote and the Muslim vote and the middle ground of people in between. I think. Yeah, I mean, aside from politicians doing that sort of cheese on a stick stuff about, celebrating Eid or Black History Month, it's the same category of stuff, isn't it? It's just, what am I supposed to do this month, and what will I be criticised if I don't post on this day or this particular week? But it is affecting lots of things, like Marco referred to earlier when he was talking about education. I mean, it affects the kind of food served in schools, and whether it has to be halal, whether things like bacon get removed from all sorts of public bodies where they would normally be served, and whether that then affects the farmers and pig farmers in different parts of the country, and all those kind of things. And then, of course, whether it affects what people can wear and that kind of stuff. And I think the bigger problem, though, is the shutting down of debate. It's the creep of shutting down debate in all sorts of places where it becomes you're not allowed to say this because. And I think this woolly definition that we've spoken of in the past for Islamophobia, which in some places seems to include frowning at a Muslim, regardless of your intent, even if they've just stepped on your foot or got, if you will be frowning at them in any, they not even notice they're Muslim necessarily. But it's such a loose definition, and there's so many things are brought into it that it's that in itself causes a lot of tensions.
By the way, have you seen the definition of Islamophobia? That's it's hilarious. It's the group of parliamentary cross benches for cross parties, whatever. The definition of Islamophobia they're trying to push is Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expression, listen to this, of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. It's like if you do that, I mean...
Have you ever come across a definition which leaves you more confused at the end of it than it did at the start? And that is its intent.
And that's just designed to shut down debate, because that definition will frighten everyone. If I say something against Islam or something against anything, I'll be accused of being racist.
Yes, it is. There is a sort of creep around these kind of things. You've referred to this, Richard, but there is a peculiar paradox of our society where, although we have an established religion, a lot of our political discourse for a long time has been very secular, whereas then in the US it's the other way around. They're not allowed to establish a religion, and yet religion's been very involved. And I think part of that may be, in a sense, Britain, I think, is probably more vulnerable to the ravages of multiculturalism than another society, and that might be because of our uncodified constitution. The constitution being uncodified means that it's more fundamentally open to change, and then in a sense the values of the society may be more open to change in a certain sense, and you might be able to get more radical change. However, so that's partly why I'm in favor of codifying the constitution and making things a bit more solid and foundational. However, it also means that whilst things, I would say, seem to be getting worse, it's not necessarily a straight graph, right? Where it's just getting more and more awful. Because if we were talking about this 10 years ago, when Anjem Choudhury was a notable kind of person influencing the Islamic right, shall we say, this Islamism, whatever you want to say, I would have been very, very concerned and much less optimistic than I am now. He, for people who don't know him, was this kind of one of these street preachers who went around and picked up a bit of a following and stayed sort of on the right side of the law in terms of what he was saying for a long time, and kind of wanted to detoxify the branding whilst ultimately still kind of pushing a very radical version of political Islam. He eventually went to jail for being the head of a terror group. He was then released after, I think, about 5 years. And then 7 or 8 months ago, he was arrested for a very similar thing as well. And given his sort of prominence about 10 years ago, I would have been very pessimistic. Yet in a sense, the graph was going up, and then it got slightly better. So whilst because of our flexibility, in a sense, we're also more flexible to perhaps getting a bit better, which is what I hope. And the metrics for measuring improvement of values within the Muslim communities in the UK, I think you can choose multiple ones, but I mentioned before is attitudes towards homosexuality, and I think that's a good one, because in the sense that that's such a problem for conservative Islam, and a sign of the success of the integration of Muslims into society in the United States would be that increasing acceptance of gay marriage, which we haven't seen here. And that might be a metric by which we should pay attention to in following years, just to see whether things are getting better or getting worse. And in a sense, we don't know whether we're in a slight lull at the moment in the graph's increase. And I hope that we aren't just in a slight lull and it's going to get worse. I hope it continues to go down, but we'll see. And I think that's one of the ways people can see whether it's getting better or getting worse. Anything? Yeah.
In the sense that is some growing up has taken place, or at least some recognition of the PR necessities in moving from street firebrands to more organized websites and a more democratic means of changing things. I mean, that is in that sense, it's certainly an improvement. I think also the side of this that we've not touched upon is the extent to which even the religious elements of like the Church of England or the Archbishop of Canterbury are more likely to comment on Islamophobia than they are even Christianity, it would seem, half the time. So that need to always talk to the poor and the oppressed that drives them so much, and in a way that is really, I don't think that would translate to the US. I'm not sure that there's an equivalent of that. I doubt you would find an equivalent of that to the extent that it happens here, and that's because even the church here, which is obviously not something I'm want to fly the flag for, but it is certainly not representing even the Christian values for those who believe in them. And I think that's also fed into a lot of the naivety to do with immigration and people coming across on boats and via the church, pretending to be Christians for the duration of approving their asylum, and then reverting straight back to being Muslims the moment they've had their photograph taken with the local archbishop, and they've got their paperwork, which has been quite an extensive problem that has been brought to light recently.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard about that. I'll say, just to contradict what I was saying earlier about the undefinableness of British values, the one British value which we still hold to is the propensity to be embarrassed and cringing and not wanting to offend anyone and blah blah blah. And the Church of England is an excellent example of that kind of thing, where the Archbishop of Canterbury will apologize for all of his own opinions and yet will let everyone else's just flood in. And not that I want to defend the Church of England at all, but they're a good example of that one British value, to be a bit embarrassed about yourself. Marco, any other thoughts?
Well, and another important election, another election going on this year is going to be made, a European election for the European Parliament and all this kind of malarkey. And unlike us, yes, we are talking about this stuff now. We have a debate in Britain. This thing is coming out in the open. And politicians at some point will have to take a stand, and things will sort themselves out in a way, because we are open and we are not inflexible. As you said, we are the fact that our constitution is not written in stone allows us to have some sort of flexibility, which allowed, and that's why the monarchy is still standing, really, because unlike other monarchy, it was fairly flexible and was open to change. But Europeans are not having this debate. They're not allowed to. This debate is shut down by the institutions, and that's why Europe is sliding slowly to the far right. And people, the only output that people find in order to express their opinion is voting for the far right, and that's hopefully something that we will be able to avoid, because that's absolutely the negation of anything we believe in. Going towards fascism, whether it's fascism dictated by religion or by the god of society, it's bad either way. It moves away from the freedom of the individual, and that can only be bad news for anyone.
Certainly a full analysis of both how the UK has voted later in the year and how the EU will have voted, all the countries, is going to be necessary to really understand what the trend is, and where the different extent to which different countries are at on this journey, and whether we're all necessarily heading the same way or not.
Just off the back of what you were saying, Richard, Marco, about the Constitution, my only resistance to a codified Constitution and to keeping our flexible current one is just because our own politicians, were they asked to draft the Constitution right now, would pale in comparison to the American founding fathers who codified a rather good one, even though it was flawed in notable ways. I think now they would create one that was probably really disastrous, and probably would talk about queuing and tea and cricket on Sundays or something. All right, guys. We've just got a few minutes left. Oh, I should say, actually, we did get a couple of super chats. So we got 150 from Gail Parker. Thank you so much, Gail. And then 399 from Jonathan. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Any final quick thoughts? I'm probably down on this topic, but anything from you guys?
No, I mean, I think tomorrow, I think, as I understand it, you're likely going to be covering the result in part of the Rochdale election, depending on how it goes. And I think that's one to tune in for, to see what the early indications are from that constituency, and what that can tell you about UK right now.
Yes, will they put an old rank communist British hating man into parliament, or will they choose one of the other retrobates who are on that election list? We will see.
I'm glad I don't live.
Yes, decidedly me as well. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. As you say, we'll be back tomorrow on the reality show covering the election result. I'm not sure exactly what we're doing on the daily objective, but yeah, we'll see something there. Daniel Krauss, hey, no opinions moratorium. There's a moratorium on the election right now. The British government will come after us for what I've just said. Oh, well. All right, guys, you can see my Twitter in the description along with my Substack. You should all go follow and subscribe on there. And you can see Marco and Richard's work on the Briefly Objective, which will have a video probably coming out either, I think, probably early next week, maybe something like that.
Probably tomorrow and Monday, I would think.
And I think the shows come out daily. So,
yeah.
Fantastic. All right, everybody, we'll see you all tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.